So I will not pretend to you that I know even a large part of what has to be known. And I am extremely eager to receive suggestions from you about ideas, additional sources, suggestions that will help make this a better investigation. You will ask me, what is this? You will hear very, very soon. Now, there is a problem with many problems that historians have, and one of the major problems, of course, is sources. And sometimes sources are too good. I will introduce this with a short introduction, then you will see. There is a story that the Khazars, a nation in Central Asia, converted to Judaism. Very nice story for Jews. How did they convert to Judaism? The king of the Khazars wanted a true religion, and he invited representatives of the Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, and each representative quickly presented his position, and after a little bit of discussion, the king of the Khazars decided that Judaism was the true religion and converted. And Jews liked this story very much. It was very popular. However, of course, as we all know, conversion is not so simple. To be Jew is not simple at all. You can even ask some obvious questions when you consider the Khazars, who were nomads, who fought battles with everybody around them. And you can imagine that here they were fighting a battle with the Alans or the Arabs or the Pechenegs or whoever they were fighting, and they looked at their watch and they said, "Oh, it is the Sabbath. It is time to go to synagogue." This does not fit so much. So why then did so many people accept this story? There is a beautiful correspondence in Hebrew between Chazdai ibn Shaprut, who was an important leader of the Jewish community in Spain, and the king of the Khazars, Yosef. Chazdai wrote the king of the Khazars to ask him, "What is your country like?" And he wrote a long letter full of references to the Bible and Jewish tradition, explaining about his love of the Torah, his love of Judaism, and all the Jewish scholars who lived in Khazaria. Have you ever heard of a Jewish scholar from Khazaria? I've never heard of it. If you do, tell me. But I've never heard of it. But he wrote a beautiful letter. Why then, what happened? This letter was quoted over and over again, a beautiful description. However, very few people asked a very simple question: is the letter a true letter or not? Now, when I was a student at the university, like many of you here, I did not have enough money. I assume you do, but I didn't. And I did two things. I washed floors. I am very good at washing floors. And I was a teacher in school. And as you know, when you were a teacher, maybe the students learn, the teachers certainly learn. One of the things that I learned is, if I get a paper from a student, and he writes things like humanitas and ex cathedra and ergo, he did not write that paper. I learned that one has to be a little cautious when reading a student paper. But this is not just student papers. When you read a letter of the king of the Khazars, full of Bible and beautiful Hebrew, you have to begin to ask, where did he learn so much beautiful Hebrew? And why do we not have any Hebrew literature from Khazaria except for this letter? So, since I am a great scholar, I actually read what other people wrote about the letter, and each person who wrote about it said, it's a wonderful letter, but there is one problem. But if you take all the problems together, there are many problems. The geography in the letter is wrong. The language in the letter is wrong. The letter shows every sign of being falsified, of being a forged letter. Maybe it was written in Spain, maybe it was written in Italy, but it is very difficult to believe that it was written in Itil, the capital of the Khazars. And the truth is, if you go through all of the other stories about the Khazar conversion, the minute you look carefully at a story, it falls apart. There's, in my opinion, no evidence at all that the Khazars converted to Judaism. No evidence. Not the king, not the population, not one person, in my very not humble opinion. What about the events of Khmelnytsky in 1648? There's no question that this was an extremely violent period, that there were large population losses. As far as I know, there's been no calculation of the total population losses. Jews died, and Jews talk about that, but many Poles died. My guess is that more Ukrainian civilians died than anybody, between the Tatars and the Poles and the killing back and forth. And there's killing at the sword, and there's death because of hunger. This was a period of a lot of deaths, and people are often interested in the great story and not in the human reality. But after all of this, there was a book written by Natan Netta Ganover, which is printed and reprinted and re-reprinted, which is very, very well written. Very well written. He has stories. They are written on a number of levels. He explains about the reasons for the rebellion, which is a very clever tactic of the author because it makes the story more believable. It adds authenticity. Even when there are questions, he describes a place where all the Jews were killed, and then you begin to ask, if all the Jews were killed, how did he know what happened? Because who told the story? The Ukrainian leader came to him, the Polish leader came to him. There are certain problems when you think about the text carefully. But since it is beautifully written, it was printed and reprinted and entered very much into the Jewish historical memory. Now, this did not really have much to do with me until many years ago, about 15 years ago. I was asked by a friend who had been in Kiev if I would look into the numbers of the Jewish victims of the events of 1648. I think that this is something problematic just to look at casualties on one side, because one really should look at the broad picture. And here I have to admit to what everybody knows, is I am not a Ukrainian historian, and I do not pretend to have any kind of mastery of Ukrainian sources. Hopefully, such efforts require cooperation, and would be silly for one individual to pretend that he knows all the sides. So I agreed, even though I was not so totally comfortable, to deal with the question of the Jewish casualties of 1648. The question is, how do you go to measure the number of individuals who died? Because nobody was there counting bodies. There was no television or radio or cameras. And not only that, there was no need to count. What was the purpose of counting? People died, they were buried. Or in the best of circumstances, they were buried. But there was nobody to give a report to, no way to calculate. So I realized that this is not a simple topic. According to Jewish sources, the number of casualties was very high. 80,000, 100,000, 120,000. This has many implications. To kill 120,000 people, or to kill 80,000 people by hand with the technology of killing that existed then, is a major task. That is many, many people to kill. Even in Babi Yar with the Einsatzgruppen, it took days with guns. And we're talking about a period in which artillery was just beginning to be used. To kill so many people by hand implies a certain interest and concern and characteristics, which is not to be taken lightly. So there are implications to numbers, but I think it's important to look at numbers because an examination of numbers often leads to a better understanding of reality. Because very often we talk about big terms, we don't see what was actually happening. So the first question was, what kind of sources would there be? And it was clear that good sources would not exist. So if you don't have good sources, you have to take bad sources. So the first question I think that one has to examine is, how many Jews were living in Ukraine in 1645? Now, if 100,000 Jews were killed, there must have lived 125,000 at least. Not everybody was killed. Where would 125,000 Jews live? This is not a simple problem, because cities in the 17th century were not big. So let's imagine that in a city of 25,000 people, there were 20,000 Jews. That could happen. But it could only happen on one condition: if almost everybody in the city was Jewish. Could such a situation exist? It could exist in theory, but it could only exist, if it did exist, this would have been something that everybody talked about. And nobody talked about that. There's references, obviously, to cities with Jewish communities, but not where 80% or 90% of the community was Jewish. And if we're talking about spreading out into small towns, there's a limit. Small towns also could not have been all Jewish. So it very quickly became clear that one has to be very, very cautious examining the numbers. And here one needs to have a bit of imagination and also to be ready to make mistakes. And I promise you, I'm certain I made many. Hopefully others will help me recognize the mistakes. Now, the question is it possible to get a good picture of the population of the Jews in the Ukrainian lands before the events of 1648. Luckily for me, a very important researcher named Moritzi Horn studied the situation in Ruthenia, and he came to a conclusion that in that region there were about 45,000 Jews in towns, in cities, in towns, and about 9,000 Jews in villages, which is a respectable number, even though I suspect the true number might be less. What is interesting is the fact that he found that most of the population was an urban population. However, I'm much more interested in the areas of Volyn, Podylia, and Bratslav and up to Kiev. This was the area where the heaviest fighting took place and where most of the descriptions of population loss existed. Now here, it is necessary to work indirectly because we do not have very many reports on Jewish population in Volyn at this time. What we do know is information on some of the larger towns in Volyn, but not all. However, from Jewish communal reports about famous rabbis or about major communities, it is possible to get a rough picture of the field, so that if we know about the communities, then we know that there were at the time in Volyn 6 major communities: Ostrov, Khmelnytsky, Lutsk, Stars, Konstantinov, Vladimir, and Lubartov. We have information only about 3 or 4 of these communities. However, here I think that one can assume that a large community is pretty similar to another large community. There will be differences, maybe plus 30%, minus 30%, and I'm not bothered by a small error like 30%. I become concerned by 100% error. So that if we take the large communities, then that we have in a usual large community about 150 Jewish homes. So that would give us in 6 large communities about 900 Jewish homes. Then we can pick a multiplier. How many people lived in a Jewish home? Usually people like to use 6 as the number for people who lived in a Jewish home. What is the reason for it? It's a good number, 6 days of the week. It seems nice, a father and mother, some older children, some younger children. It's very, very difficult to get an average number. I talked yesterday with someone and they suggested that it should even be higher than 6 because there were servants and there were relatives. Although when there are servants, you don't know if they were Jewish servants or non-Jewish servants. So we can take 6 or 7, but this would give us If we take 6, then we have, that would give us about 5,400 people living in large towns. If we take 7, so then it just goes up, to 6,500. I try not to be exact, because when you see a number like 6,300, then you think, oh, Stampfer knows something. It's 6,300 and not 6,400. The more a number is round, the more the person looking at the number realizes that it is an estimate and not a precise number. And this is all not precise. Already we can see that if in the large towns in Volyn there were 7,000 people, that there is no way that one could achieve 100,000 casualties unless people were dying more than one time. But that is not a possibility that I'm willing to consider. So that if we take this type of a number of about, say, 6,500, and then go down to the smaller sized communities, then we end up with numbers that are in the maybe a bit more than 25,000 total Jewish population of Volyn. Now, does this type of a number make sense? Here, I decided that there is a need to examine the numbers on material basis, because I simply do not trust when people define a number. One can do a very interesting test. I can ask you how many people are in this room, and you will say a number, and then if you count, most times the number is different. Here it is a smaller number. If you go to a demonstration in a public place, a big demonstration, it is very difficult. Can you see the difference between 50,000 and 100,000 at a demonstration? I think there is only one way to know how many people are at a demonstration. How do you know? You have to measure the area that is filled by people. Then you have to take a photograph and see how close are people standing to each other. You take the metrage, you count how many people by square meter, and then you multiply. When we read about a demonstration that took place, who does that? Nobody. People on one side will say 100,000 people came to demonstrate. The other side will say 20,000, maybe less. Everybody throws a number, but very few people actually measure the space and the density of the population. I also talk about this, but I don't do it. However, when we're dealing with the Jews, what can we use to see if these kinds of numbers are reasonable numbers? How can we check? Now, this problem bothered me because most of what I'm doing is speculation, but there is a limit to speculation. Until one year I was in synagogue, since I'm a very holy person, and it was boring in synagogue, which often happens, and I began to look around and say, I wonder how many people are in synagogue. So I made an estimate, how many people I think, and then I counted. And I was wrong by about 40%. It was terrible. And then I realized that synagogues can be interesting places. Why? In Jewish tradition, every man goes to synagogue. Now what does that mean? That when you build a synagogue, how big does it have to be? More or less big enough for the community. Now, you can ask a very reasonable question. There can be more than one synagogue. But in most Jewish communities, there was only one synagogue. Why? The synagogue was a place where people not only prayed, but where the elite demonstrated their power. And it was very important for communal authority that everybody be in the same place. Because there are different honors given in the synagogue. People can be asked to read the Torah. They can be asked to hold the Holy Scrolls. And this gives honor. And you can also deny honor and not give somebody honor. So that having one synagogue is a very powerful tool for community control. Extremely powerful. And community leaders did not want separate synagogues for different groups. As a matter of fact, the Hasidic movement began at a time when separate synagogues were permitted. If it was not for that fact, it is very doubtful that the Hasidic movement could have started, because if there would have been only one synagogue, they could not have generated the power that they did generate over time. One synagogue gives power. I will give you a very odd example. What was the strangest synagogue in Jewish history? There were actually at least two. One in Moscow and one in Buenos Aires. Can you think of a reason why in both cities? Both in Moscow and in Buenos Aires, there were synagogues for the Jewish pimps and prostitutes. Now, this is a topic that we Jews do not like to talk about, but there were Jewish criminals, and being a pimp, a person who sells women, buys women, is the worst of the worst. So there were Jewish criminals in many places. What happened when a Jewish criminal received news that his father or mother died? By Jewish tradition, he has to go to synagogue and to say a memorial prayer. What happened when they went to synagogue? The rabbi of the community took the person, threw him out. Who wants to have such terrible people in the synagogue? What did these people do? They made their own synagogues so that they would have a place where they could say the prayers and get their honors. This, you agree with me, is strange. Buenos Aires was a center for this terrible business. So was Moscow. These existed. A synagogue is a powerful structure. So then, what is possible to use as a replacement for a census? One can take a synagogue that was built at the time and see how big was the synagogue. If you have a community of 10,000 people, which is a very big community, you need a very big synagogue. Now, you can measure more or less how much space is needed for a chair. How much space is needed? About 1.5 meters square. You need in the synagogue, you need a little room to walk around, but that is basically a simple measure. Obviously, populations grew, they also shrank. Some people built a synagogue that had room for more children, for less, but no community would build a synagogue that is too small, and no community would build one that is too big. If it's too big, you're wasting money. You don't build a cathedral for 50 people. If it's too small, then that means that people will be forced to set up a second synagogue, which is not desirable. And I found, to my joy, that the few synagogues that we have from the 17th century fit more or less a picture of communities with maybe 200 males maximum or less. In other words, there is no possible way that 20,000 Jews could have been in some city, because that would have required massive synagogues and more than one, which did not exist. So you cannot measure a synagogue and say this gives you the number of Jews, but it gives you a framework, more or less the population size. If then we proceed to Podilya, it is not surprising that the population there would be smaller. There were 3 major communities in Podilya: Mezhibozh, Bar, and Sataniv. Now we return to talk about Bar, because Bar was a place where the Jewish community apparently by Hanover was destroyed, and so that we can get a more or less a population maybe of 9,000 Jews in Podilya. Moving on, Wroclaw and Kiev, maybe 9,000, 8,000, 10,000. So but we're talking about more than 2,000 and much, much less than 20,000. So that more or less we're dealing, excluding Ruthenia or Red Rus, we're talking maybe about a population maximum of 40,000 individuals. Now here, it is necessary to consider a little bit, how do normal people behave in time of crisis? And I will add one interesting fact which I found. How do people behave in time of crisis? At first, they do not know what to do. That's normal. When the uprising began, and there was certainly violence at the beginning of uprising, there were a number of communities where the Jewish population was attacked, not specifically along with the Shlachta. The Jews did not have convenient neighbors in this respect. However, after a number of violent encounters, what obviously happened, people in the region knew what was happening. Now, what would the logical activity be for Jews who heard that in other cities their Jews had been killed? What is the logical response? To be careful, and if you hear that the fighting is coming close, to escape. Jews were, in this respect, had a great advantage over peasants. Why? Jews were much more mobile in 2 ways. First off, their economic activity depended largely on skills. whether it be trades or commercial skills. That means that if you go to another place, you have a possibility of reestablishing yourself. I often give the example of people who emigrate from Israel, from other countries. Let's take two groups which are convenient for me. Lawyers, people who know law, and doctors. Which population emigrates more? Doctors. Why? If you go to America or England and you are a doctor, you do not have to speak good English. If you know where to cut and how to sew, you are in business, you're a doctor. A lawyer is very difficult. The laws in different countries are different, and it's also very important to have command of the language. Migration is selective. Young people who do not have families migrate more than people who have families and responsibilities because it's more complicated. Merchants and tradespeople can run more easily than peasants whose only possession is land, because land you cannot take with you. So Jews were at an advantage, and there would only be a reason to stay if there was an ideology which said that dying brings you to heaven. As we know, there are views which say that it is wonderful to die for your religion and to go to heaven. Jewish tradition is that it's wonderful to live for your tradition, and maybe you'll go to heaven. So that it would have been highly illogical